Grip with Dr. Chuck F. Betters, produced by Mark Inc. Ministries. Each In His Grip message is designed to help turn our hearts toward Jesus and equip us to walk by faith. Let's join Dr. Betters in the sanctuary as he preaches the series, Midwives of the Messiah.
Did Bathsheba know what awaited her? In fact, from this story, we can draw a critical comparison to how you and I foolishly enter onto that slippery slope of moral failure, where we are where we should not be, doing what we should not be doing, failing to see the great victories God has given us, on alert on the heels of great spiritual victory, on alert as we prepare for great spiritual victory. When you read the accounts of Josephus, Bathsheba was known for being a very beautiful woman. But her husband, Uriah, was also known as a man of bravery and great strength. When I read Josephus' account of the actual battle that ended Uriah's life, he had basically been deserted. It was a plotted desertion. David had plotted a strategy where Uriah would go into battle, and he would take some of the choicest men with him, not knowing that when he handed these written orders over to the captain, to Joab, those written orders were his own death certificate. He would go into battle knowing that he was about to face the most incredible onslaught from the enemy at the most vulnerable place at the gate of the city. Many would die, and they knew it. What he didn't know was that when the gates were opened and the troops inside began to attack Uriah, that the orders that were given from David through Joab, those sealed orders that Uriah carried, told Joab that when the men come out, pull your troops back except for Uriah. We want Uriah to die. He doesn't tell Joab why he wants Uriah dead. But it's clear to Joab, Uriah is to die. The reason is because Bathsheba is now carrying David's baby. Talk about a soap opera. And when Uriah came home on leave, David basically said, take a few days. Go be with your wife. She's made all the preparations for you. Go sleep with her. She's your wife. You've been out in battle for a long time. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us this, and I'm only filling in what I believe are some subplots to the story that may or may not be true. I think Uriah was onto this. I think he knew something was wrong. I mean, after all, what man out in battle for as long as he was, coming home on leave, would not want to be with this beautiful woman? But he refused. He told David, he said, how can I go and enjoy the pleasures of my marriage when Joab and the other armies are out there, camped out there, they're in danger, my fellow soldiers are out there. I need to keep myself separated so that I'm not distracted by any of that because I'm a man of war. So what does David do? He brings him into his house. He said, let's have a drink or two. And he gets him drunk, hoping that in his drunken stupor, Uriah would then go and be with his wife. Why? Because there was a baby there. And he didn't want the responsibility of the baby. He wanted to be able to blame the child on Uriah. Nowhere in Scripture is polygamy acceptable. Nowhere does God call a relationship with a woman outside of marriage anything but adultery or fornication. Nowhere does God command him to do this. Yet God seems to be silent in condemning it. And so we look at that and we say, well, what's going on here? Was David really granted an exception that no one else was? Here is what God does not leave out. he does not leave out of the story the consequences of polygamy. You won't miss that anywhere. You won't miss that at all, because the consequences of polygamy are very clear. Look at what happened with Jacob, and look at his 12 children and his several wives and the intermarriage that took place there. You have rape and incest and all kinds of horrible things. And in David's case, what you have as the result of this harem building is that God said through Nathan the prophet, the peace that you desire will never enter this house. You will always be a man of war. There seems to be no need to condemn the polygamy because the polygamous act condemns itself. And we see that in this case, David is about to bring a woman into his harem that in the social setting was more than permitted. And so he commands her to come. Can you imagine Bathsheba's thoughts when she knew that she was obligated to answer the summons of the king? Can you imagine what went through her mind? You see, David's task as king was to protect his citizens. He was now exposing one of his citizens to great moral failure. There's no indication that she knew why he summoned her. She has no idea. There's no indication that she has any idea why she's being summoned to see the king. Did it have something to do with Uriah? After all, he was a pretty important soldier in David's army. Why was he inviting me here? All of the depictions that we have of Bathsheba show her as this flirtatious woman who lured David into immorality, but the scriptures don't seem to tell us that. God chose to show us the horrible consequences of this act of polygamy. In this case, it involved the death of a baby. Later on, the betrayal of David by his own son Absalom. We see a picture unfolding of a dysfunctional family that made David a man of war for the rest of his life, and he never enjoyed one moment of peace. He would never see that great temple built because God had stripped from him that privilege. Yet he is referred to as a man after God's own heart. Oh, I do believe Bathsheba eventually had some culpability, but the Bible seems to pull us away from that and point us to the fact that she was merely obeying the authority structure over her. It's likely she had no choice. It's likely she was commanded to obey, that to do otherwise, since David was the king, would have been an act that was punishable. This is what you and I today in our society would call abuse. That's what this is. This woman is the victim of abuse, like some of you women have been. This woman is being abused by a man in power, a man whose power went to his head, a man who thought that because he won everything by the hand of God, that he was allowed to do anything he desired. That's abuse. There's no other way around this. I believe Bathsheba is what we would call today a victim of sexual abuse and harassment. Can you imagine the kind of life that Bathsheba had? First, she was a military wife. Those of you who are military families know that that's not an easy life. You kiss your husband goodbye, and you don't know whether or not he's coming back. You know he's committed to his task as a warrior. You know that his life is sold out as a soldier. You hear about all these soldiers today that come home on leave. The one thing they want to do is they want to go back. They want to go back. They want to be with their comrades. They want to be able to fight some more. It's in their blood. She was a military wife. She was more than likely alone when her husband was at war. She had the protection of her father, but she was, for all intents and purposes, socially alone. She lived in the inner sanctum of power, as I said earlier, in the shadow of the king. She probably knew people. and people knew her. Socially, she must have been someone that everyone was aware of. Everyone knew who Bathsheba was, at least everyone this side of the tracks, so to speak. And what happens to her? She becomes the victim of a man in heat. A man who lusted after her like a dog licking his chops in heat. David often prayed and even wrote a song that said this in Psalm 119. He said, "Turn my heart toward your statutes and not toward selfish gain. Turn my eyes away from worthless things. Preserve my life according to your word." If only he could have followed his own counsel. If only he had obeyed the clear scriptural qualifications for a king. The Bible was very clear as to how a king was supposed to lead. Deuteronomy 17 says, "When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, 'Let us set a king over us like all the nations around us,' be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a foreigner, like one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold." Deuteronomy 17 spells it out. One man, one woman, one lifetime. A one-woman man. In fact, when you go to the New Testament and you find the qualifications for an elder, an officer in the church, it refers to one of those qualifications as the husband of one wife, which doesn't really mean what you think it means. When it says the husband of one wife, the literal interpretation you can make of that is a one-woman man. It speaks more of his character than his marital status. His eyes are for one woman and one woman only. Well, David violates all of this. He accumulates all this great power, all this great wealth, all this great prestige, silver and gold. And in fact, when the war with the Ammonites is won, one piece of jewelry he takes home is the king's crown. And he wears this crown because it was a valuable piece of jewelry. It weighed 1 talent of gold, a lot of money. All of these things we're told that your job as king is to protect your people. That's the qualification, by the way, for a political leader, one who protects his people. The purpose of government is protection. The purpose of a president is to protect. The purpose of a Congress is to protect. We get all wrapped up in all these other things and all these other ploys and positions and what have you. But Romans 13 tells us the government has been placed there by God for the purpose of protecting its citizens. And when the government ceases to protect its citizens, it ceases to become a biblical government. Well, David is not protecting his citizens, at least not this one. Can you imagine her fear in the shadow of this evil? Because it says in verse 3, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, this is his scout, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam?" Now, this guy Eliam must have been known to David as well. "And the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" You know, implied in that statement from David's scout is, David, she's married. In one ear, out the other. Then David sent messengers to go get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. I wish I had the time to develop that with you, except to say this. That indicates to me that this was all David's doing. David was the initiator, David was the culprit, and David had the greatest culpability. Then she went back home. The woman conceived, and she sent word to David I am pregnant. Josephus tells us, or at least alludes to this fact. The reason she sent word back to David was, David, you need to protect yourself. I'm pregnant. And you and I both know that the penalty for what we did is death. The penalty for me and the penalty for you for adultery is death. So you need to know I'm pregnant. Now, I think word was already out that she was pregnant, and I think that Nathan the prophet already knew this, because at least we're told later that God visited him in a dream and told him so. So everything's about to break. She spent the afternoon with David doing the unthinkable, and afterwards she purifies herself. That is, she engages in a spiritual exercise to morally clean up the mess. That's ridiculous. People don't do that. Oh, yes, they do. Oh, yes, they do. I have talked to people who profess faith in Christ that are involved in sexual affairs, who, when they're finished with their sexual encounter, go and have devotions together. They go and they pray together. That somehow or another, God is going to bless this union. It doesn't work that way. All hell is about to break loose in this woman's life. What thoughts must have run through her mind? What's going to happen when my husband comes home? What am I going to do with this baby? What's my dad going to think? David was warned. This woman belongs to another man. How often does God try to warn us with divine interventions? How often have you and I been warned? We walk around, we're about to do something that we know we have no business doing, and God sends his messengers. He sends his angels of accountability, and we're warned. We're kind of slapped on the face. We're thrown some cold water in our face. What are you doing? What are you doing here? Stop. You're about to make a very bad decision. Stop. Back off. Take a deep breath. Fan yourself. Whatever you need to do, back off. You're about to do something stupid. Somehow or another, we move ahead without any concern about the consequences. How often do we ignore them? And we dismiss his voice because our own lusts are too loud. We listen to the lust of the heart, the lust of the flesh, and we do so in the pride of life. We reason something like this: I deserve this. I worked for this. Others do it. Why not me? I'm entitled to my happiness. I need this. My wife is this. My husband is that. My children do this. My spouse does that. Yet God, in his love and mercy, continues to send divine warning shots. Maybe it comes in the form of a friend. Maybe it comes in the form of a sermon. Maybe this one. Maybe this week you're about to set the stage to ruin your own life. You're going to face a choice this week as to whether or not you're going to go this way or this way. And you're being fired a warning shot. I don't know what you're going to face. I'm not omniscient. I don't know all things. I look around and I see a bunch of wonderful, nice people, people I love, people I care for, but I know that among us there are people who are stupid. And you and I are part of that stupidity, aren't we? Say amen. About yourself, you have to say that we are stupid at times. We do the wrong things. We make the wrong choices. This week, some of you are going to make the wrong choices. And here's the warning shot. You've been warned. Or maybe it's a nudge in your own soul. Maybe it's a tug of conscience. Or maybe we observe others as they prosper in their wickedness, and somehow or another we reason that our sin is acceptable. Oh, on and on the list could go. Keep in mind, David is nearly 50 years old at this point. 50 years old. He'd been around the block a few times. He should have been wise enough to know the difference between what he was supposed to be doing and what he ended up doing. He knew where he should have been, and he knew where he wasn't. 50 years old. And in those 50 years, he had been to hell and back. He had fought many wars. He had stayed faithful to Saul, who sought to kill him. At times with great personal courage and conviction. What happened to him? It's not as though he was a single man with no options. He was a married man. In fact, David had a major woman problem most of his life. David had many wives. And in this act of premeditated adultery, he starts this slide into the abyss of hell's fury and grasp. David had young sons by this time. Sons that, for all intents and purposes, were raised. What an example of a dad out of control. What an example of a man about to morally fall. He was the king of the most powerful nation on earth. What an example to his flock. The man that he would eventually have killed the husband of Bathsheba was loyal to him. He loved him. What a signal this sent to David's leaders. I better watch my wife while I'm away. What's he going to do to her? What power is he going to exercise? And above all of this, David was a child of God. How could he neglect so great a salvation? Can you imagine her thoughts as the rest of her life began to unravel? The great plot against Uriah, did she know about it? Was she privy to it? The pain of losing her husband in war. There's no indication anywhere that Bathsheba did not love Uriah. But she lost him in war. She had to bury her husband. The scandalous marriage with David, and eventually the loss of the baby she carried in her womb. Josephus tells us that one of the great things that bothered David, that sent him into mourning when he knew that the child was going to die, because Nathan the prophet told him the child would die as a punishment from God, David went off and he pleaded with God not to take the child. Josephus tells us because of his love for Bathsheba. He saw her. He saw what she was going to lose. This child in her womb would be taken in judgment. And Nathan the prophet warned him of that. Did she know all of that? What about the redemption of the king? After Nathan the prophet confronts him, tells him this little story, Nathan walks in after God had visited him in a dream, and he says, Mr. King, you have to judge a case for me. Here's the case. Here's this rich guy, he's got all these lambs. Here's this poor guy, he has one little ewe lamb. And this ewe lamb is raised as the family pet. That's the word that's used in the Hebrew, by the way, the family pet. That lamb, that ewe lamb, ate dinner with the family. The rich man has some guests come in, Nathan tells the story. And when he looks around, he sees this ewe lamb that has been raised in this very precious environment, and he says, you know what, I don't want to kill any of my lamb, so I'm going to take this one. And he takes the poor man's lamb, he kills it, and he serves it to his guests, and leaves this family over here grieving. David, in self-righteous indignation, stands up and says, first of all, he has to pay back 4 lambs. 4 times, that's what the law says. And then he must die. Can you imagine? When Nathan looked at him and pointed his little crooked finger in his face and said, you are that man. Now, David had a choice. This is why he's called a man after God's own heart. As you're watching the story, you're kind of rooting for Nathan. Get him, Nathan. Tell him what's going on. You stole the ewe lamb. You killed the owner. You are that man. David falls on his face. Nathan finishes the prophecy, and the child that Bathsheba bears will be taken from you. the child falls grievously ill, and David is on his face with sackcloth and ashes, begging God, at least out of love for Bathsheba, to spare this child's life. His people were afraid of his health. He hadn't eaten. He looked like death warmed over. He looked like a severe anorexic, a man who was falling apart. The strength of their great king was coming apart right before their very eyes, and they worried about him. Here, David, eat. Here, David, eat. And all he would do was mourn. And then they came in one day afraid to tell him. But he knew from the very fear that they had of telling him what had taken place, that the child was now dead. And he dresses up in his robe, he kills the fatted calf, and he begins to celebrate. He said, I know that child can't come to me, but I will go to that child. There's redemption here. For the rest of his life, he would mourn over that sin. Psalm 51 was written. The Psalms of penitence were written for the purpose of showing us the pain of the fact that David had to live with that poor moral choice the rest of his life. But so did Bathsheba. How do you think she felt when a child to her and David was born? And she was told to name him Solomon, which means peace.
Thank you for listening. For the complete sermon, please visit markinc.org and click In His Grip. Join Dr. Chuck F. Betters in the sanctuary from Monday to Thursday on the In His Grip podcast.